My name is Michael Polson. I am the director of the Cannabis Research Center, and I'm glad you could join us. I know some folks will be filtering in as we start. Um, but welcome. This is, I don't know, probably the 10th or so in our conversation series that we've been holding this year on research conducted in and of California cannabis. We've been hosting researchers that deal with different aspects of what the Cannabis Research Center is focused on and centered around, which is really the social and environmental dimensions of cannabis agriculture, cannabis policy, um, and more so these days, cannabis supply chain structure. In the series, we've mostly been highlighting the California Academic Research Grant Program participants, which was part of Prop 64, was to put aside research funds so that we could answer some really fundamental questions around cannabis legalization. This funding mandate from the legalization bill in 2016 was really unique in its mandate to really ask open questions about cannabis that aren't guided by prohibition, like much federal funding is. So today and at our last event with Katia Moisiva, we're departing a little bit from the format of engaging other researchers in California who are working through this grant program to people who aren't directly involved with it, but are doing really great research and have come to our attention. And part of this ongoing series, the purpose of the series is to bring research out to the public, to the media, to policymakers, to folks in the industry and other academics, and just people who are interested in any kind of way. So with that, let's begin. Um, I'm going to introduce Alex briefly, probably not a whole 5 minutes, because it'd be fun to just get into things. And then we'll talk about Alex's research for about 30 minutes. We'll have a Q&A after that for about 20, and then we'll just close up with some final notes and reminders about some upcoming events. So just so you know, this is structured as a Zoom call. So, you're welcome, kind of as we go and as you think of it, to use the chat function to just throw in some questions, and I'll pick up the questions as we go and maybe insert them. Alex and I kind of have an idea of what questions we want to get through. You're also free to throw in some reactions. We always appreciate a heart or a hand clap. And then if you want to wait and just ask your question when the Q&A section comes up, then you can unmute yourself and ask it as when the time comes. And I'll kind of mark that moment so people know, solicit some questions. So is that it for the slides? Great. Okay. So today we're talking with Dr. Alex Rewegan of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. I think Peng, who is administering this, will be hosting or posting a link to one of Alex's recent articles, I believe from last year, that gives a little bit of insight into some of the stuff he's doing. But today we're not going to be discussing so much that article as we're going to be discussing his recent dissertation, which I can vouch for is fabulous and really interesting and full of great content. It is called Crafting Cannabinoid Capitalism, of course, Health, Sustainability, and Regeneration in the United States. I had the pleasure of serving on Alex's dissertation committee and worked with him over time to get it together into this really wonderful document. As the title might suggest, crafting both means shaping, of course, but also Alex has an attention towards craft cannabis, the artisanal producer, which is equally a part of making this kind of new legal market landscape that we're all encountering today. And Alex, I think, there's a lot to say about health and sustainability. I just want to mention also the concept of regeneration. I think for folks who are in cannabis agriculture, maybe understand or have heard of these regenerative methods for farming, kind of regen approaches. But I think what Alex's dissertation also gets to is what ideas, relations, and historic legacies are being regenerated in all kinds of ways in this transition to legal cannabis markets. And we can think about that in terms of capitalist markets, in terms of settler colonial patterns and histories that still bear on the present. We can think about the carceral patterns of the drug war and also the full weight of industrial agriculture and regulatory capitalism that bear upon the legal market. But he also digs into finding how people, amidst all these kind of overwhelming, capital lettered forces, how they make meaning, how they're crafting new relationships with each other, with the land that they're living on, between workers and employers, how they're crafting new relationships with the plant itself. And also, I think throughout really documenting the clumsy grapplings, but purposeful grapplings with what it means to steward the environment in this kind of wild age of human-induced climate change, and also recognize the settler colonial histories of which people are very much a part. So with that, welcome, Alex. And I was wondering if you could just start with giving us just talking a bit about the contours of your research. Some folks may or may not be familiar with what it means to be an anthropologist. So if you can talk a bit about your approach, kind of what it is you actually did when you were out in the field, as it were. Maybe give a little bit of context as to how you started asking these questions and how you made your way into Humboldt.
Great. Can you hear me all right? It's working.
Great.
Thank you so much, Mike. That's a lovely introduction. We were just laughing before we started that I just finished here about a month ago and graduated from my defense where Mike was there, and I've basically evacuated the dissertation from my head until right now. So I'm so glad, Mike, that you still have a grasp on it and have summarized it really nicely. And also, just I want to thank, of course, the Berkeley CRC. I actually did a similar brown bag talk, I think, with you guys, Van Butzik in particular, I think in 2019 or something, when I was just beginning to think about this stuff. And so it really has the origin here at the Berkeley CRC way back. And so it's cool to be back afterwards. Um, yeah, so I'm an anthropologist, which means that I'm interested in how, actually, Mike, I think you've said this at a conference once, how people construct the world around them, how they make meaning of what's going on around them. And cannabis farmers are particularly interesting for thinking about that because they exist in this net of all these different changes that are happening, whether it's climate change, environmental changes, what we see now with government regulatory changes and all these things, but also a very sort of close relationship to some of the violences that we know about that happen in the United States and other places as well, especially because of the carcerality and the histories of the drug war and so forth. And so cannabis sort of really brings those to the fore over, say, other kinds of agriculture. Um, but so my journey studying cannabis actually started when I was studying scientists. So I'm an anthropologist of science and medicine in many ways. And I was doing a master's degree on some brain scientists who were studying memory in Canada. And I started to notice that all these neuroscientists across many different kinds of fields studying memory or whatever else were starting to think about the endocannabinoid system. This was coming up in conferences. They were bringing in new postdocs who were starting to poke around at cannabinoid receptors. And it seemed to be like this new frontier that was really exciting for neuroscientists, and not really even because of the drug, but just because of the science behind this system of the body. And so I really started getting interested in sort of how cannabis and our body, the mammalian body's capacity to interact with it, was becoming a scientific object for people. And this was happening in Canada in particular because the country was looking to legalize a little bit earlier than the US. It was part of sort of the prime minister's election campaign, this sort of thing. And of course, Canada is always looking for some kind of leg up in its science to kind of do something new or innovative. And cannabis was kind of becoming a place where scientists were able to latch onto as well. So it all really sort of started actually in this medical science world, which is sort of how I applied to do the project. But then I came to the US, and a lot of the conversations here were about farming, about access to land, about who actually makes the money. These questions around social equity that we're probably very familiar with, and understandably so, because the United States has sort of a more intense inequality kind of structure to it than Canada, with, better healthcare and things like this. So it wasn't as much of the conversation in Canada. It is now, and it's partly my blind spot that I wasn't paying as much of attention to it. But coming to the US, it was much more a prominent conversation of, what does a just legalization look like? And of course, what I find is that the system is kind of forced to think through capitalist markets. That's how legalization has to happen. And so my research became about sort of how are these markets formed? How are the people who are working in them thinking about them? And how is their relationship to the plant changing? And the reason I wanted to study the production aspect of things was because I found there was a lot more research interest in consumption, because naturally we think about drugs, we think about the user, we think about health. These are kind of the dominant paradigms of drugs in public health, and so there was a lot of funding and thought about that. And of course, fair anxieties about, if we're going to legalize this, we're going to have to worry about big cannabis, we're going to have to worry about advertising and all these sorts of things. But as an anthropologist, I wanted to know actually, where do these drugs come from? Who's actually growing them? And of course, there's a massive sort of underground informal market that's been doing it for decades in different ways in different states. And so there's a really important group of people, diverse group of people to think about, that's not about consumption per se. And then just niche, a kind of niche disciplinary thing is that anthropologists also who study medicine had not been thinking about very much the origin of medicines or the production of medicine. And so cannabis was an interesting place to sort of start thinking about that aspect of drugs. So ultimately, my project kind of becomes a combination of the anthropology of farming and agriculture and food, and the anthropology of drugs and medicine kind of at the same time. The cannabis farm is a really interesting place to think about that, because people that I worked with, especially, they are growing a lot of food. They're not necessarily drawing a distinction between their farming practices for food and the plant for the drug. Um, and so, yeah, I became interested in farming for these big picture questions about climate change, about industrial agriculture, these sort of big social problems. And cannabis was a really interesting sort of object to get at those.
Yeah. Yeah, that's perfect. I think it leads nicely into, let's just go straight at, so, the idea of regenerative agriculture and I think that marries a lot of the food and ag focus as well as a medicine and health focus, where people are actually regenerating some of, or generating anew in any case, concepts of health and sustainability. And obviously through these kind of what has over the last number of years really been understood as regenerative ag. Um, so I'm curious, like, what can you just talk a little bit about what regenerative agriculture is, maybe as an object, what tensions around it that you were exploring and interested in, and also like where did you get with it? How did you end up thinking about it? Um,
Yeah, so I would say that my specific interest in regenerative agriculture as like a concept came from the field. So it was what people that I was talking to in cannabis were talking about. And it wasn't even necessarily outdoor farmers who are, digging under the sun in their soil, but even folks who would kind of do like really cool sciencey hydroponic indoor stuff were thinking about how they were also trying to sort of have even this internal indoor system that was regenerating itself. And so a lot of people were talking about it in different ways around cannabis. And I sort of link this to the fact that there was a lot of money in cannabis sort of in its history, and also because it was illegal, there was a lot of attempts to innovate and try new things. And so it was sort of this interesting plant cultivation context where there was a lot of innovation around how do we do agriculture differently, even before legalization. But I found that legalization sort of intensified that for different reasons, some of the same, but also sort of different economic ones. Um, And so, in agriculture studies in general, from anthropology, social science, or whatever, the question of alternative agriculture is pretty common. It's been explored quite a bit. How do different people around the world try to resist or change industrial agriculture? How does it affect people differently in their livelihoods? And there's been lots of different agriculture movements, whether we think just organic agriculture, food co-ops, different parts of the supply chain trying to do things otherwise. And regenerative agriculture is sort of like it's the new one, it's the new trendy one. And in theory, what it's doing is it's doing more than organic, it's doing more than the ones before it, in that it's not just about sort of using inputs or practices that are considered organic, but that it's trying to find a way to actually produce those inputs locally within one's own garden or one's own farm or something, to have a kind of self-sustaining system that not only just uses kind of the land in like a circular, zero-sum way, but to actually add to the land, to actually give it more, to produce more. So to regenerate in a way that's like an N+1. Um, and I'm just sort of was interested in how cannabis farmers were using that and what they thought was interesting and useful about it. Because it wasn't just something that cannabis farmers were doing, but I'd also talked to other farmers too, like some small farms who grow corn in Southern Ontario, and they're also trying to find regenerative agriculture. And as anthropologists, we sort of see these imaginaries and these keywords as things that people attach a lot of meaning to because they have a lot of worries about where their money's going to come from or what's going to happen to their land or things like this. And so a lot of people were finding that regenerative agriculture was promising for whatever problem they had. And I wanted to know, well, what does it actually look like? Is it actually, a real thing? And what was most interesting about it was that it was a vision of alternative agriculture that could be political. So that's often a critique of alternative agriculture, is that of different kinds, is that they're just focused on like how do we make the soil really good without damaging the land, or these really sort of technical problems about like maybe botany, about yield, um, scientific kind of issues that in some ways evacuate the people question out a little bit. Not always, but that's kind of the trend, at least in the way might get picked up in mainstream contexts. But regenerative agriculture, I found, still had this possibility to be a little bit more political, especially in the cannabis space, where people were talking about labor quite a bit, right? Like part of being regenerative and doing our farm in a regenerative way meant that our workers also had to be regenerated and healthy and happy. And I found that the farmers, folks who've been following California farmers have literally been protesting and holding signs and being political, and doing so in the name of regenerative agriculture and what it represents for them. And so I like that it was still kind of a political project as much as it was a scientific one, and that they were trying to combine these things together. And so my study is kind of a story of one farm, just one farm, and I bring in other examples too, but it's mostly a close study of one farm and how they were trying to use whatever they imagined regenerative agriculture to be, to survive this transition to legalization. And it sort of just breaks down different aspects of what was regenerative agriculture, how was it happening, was it working or not, what did the workers think about it, what did the owners think about it. And so it's kind of a close empirical study, a case study of how regen ag is rolling out.
That's really cool. Yeah. Yeah, I'll be curious as time goes on, to what degree regenerative agriculture as a phenomenon kind of retains some of that political possibility. It's particularly its engagement with human relations rather than kind of technical or environmental modifications to achieve optimal, product results. And I think that's been a tension within the Appalachians formation too in California, is this balance between, well, not even a balance, but is really the scope of what it is that Appalachians entail, right? All the way from the cultural and historical aspects and perhaps the labor practices, all the way to, the technical aspects of the soil and what kind of strains express in certain ways in particular watersheds, et cetera.
Mhm.
So it'll be something to keep an eye on. I know I was, and you and I have had a lot of conversations about this over time. And actually, I think maybe our next brown bag is with Caitlin Reed, who's written Settler Cannabis. I know you've had kind of an ongoing engagement, one that I think you also really, I think, more profoundly discovered and encountered more in the field too, with the living legacies and very much alive dynamics of settler colonialism in the US. And so I'm wondering if you could just speak to how either the work of Caitlin Reed, but also just in more generally kind of frames of settler colonialism informed your work and what importance you felt it had, or you saw that it had to the material, to the direct um, folks you were studying with and environments you were in.
Yeah, thanks. So in actually studying in Canada, there was at the time, this is like, 2010s, quite a big presence of Indigenous scholarship, Indigenous scholars themselves taking a really prominent sort of position in what people were reading, how anthropology departments were thinking about things. Canada has kind of a more prominent Indigenous state kind of discourse that isn't as common in the United States, especially on the East Coast. Um, and so being a scholar in Canada was thinking about settler colonialism just kind of all the time. And so I came here to the US and found that it wasn't really as much of a conversation at all. But I knew that it had to be sort of a part of what this conversation was about legalization and how land was going to be used and what are the real sort of legacies of the war on drugs and what is that embedded in. Um, and so when I went to California, I did have in mind like, okay, I'm this white guy from Canada, right? I'm not indigenous, and I'm interested sort of in what settler farmers are thinking about. And I wasn't necessarily conceiving of anybody in those categories per se in a preconceived way, but wanted to know how those categories were doing things for people in place.
Mm,
Um, and what I learn, of course, is that the West Coast is much newer in terms of its colonization from European migrations and so forth, compared to the East Coast. And I had never actually been to the West Coast before, so sort of encountering indigenous culture it's actually quite prominent in Northern California in a way that it's not here on the East Coast or even where I'm from in Canada around Toronto. Um, and so I'm in the field and I'm working with these farmers, considering myself sort of studying up in a way. A lot of these folks are landowners, and they have workers who they're hiring and so forth. And a lot of them were conceiving of themselves as settlers, or they understood that there was this history, or there is this ongoing history there, and that it mattered to sort of what their farm practices looked like, or how they thought legalization policy should roll out and what social equity would look like and what it would mean to steward this land that they had been on during Prohibition. Um, and so I'm doing all this research, and then I finish sort of the fieldwork aspect, and then Caitlin Reed's really awesome book comes out, and I was like, oh wow, this is sort of everything that I was just kind of noticing and thinking about, like really nicely put together. And so I was like, wow, so Caitlin Reed has done the critique of settler colonialism and its relationship to cannabis in this particular Northern California context. Which of course is linked to broader histories of how the environment was used and configured in Northern California. There's like the trifecta that every historian talks about. You've got the gold, you've got the lumber, the timber, and you've got the cannabis now.
mm,
And so uh, so I sort of wanted to know, okay, well, what does this actually look like ethnographically? So we're probably not going to get all the cannabis farmers to just leave the land or something like that. But what are they actually doing to address kind of these historical injustices? Are they thinking about it? Does it matter to the workers? And what I found ultimately was that at least for the people that I studied with who were trying to think environmentally friendly ways and in regenerative agriculture ways, the history of settler colonialism and like sort of the way that it structured their capacity to actually live on their land in certain ways was something that they couldn't ignore. The fact that they were locked into certain kinds of like nutrient regimes, or they could only get their fertilizer from some place. They had to use certain kinds of tools and techniques, that these were part and parcel of the same histories of settler colonialism that had sort of created the nation in a certain way. And this involved, for me, like one of the most like profound ones was the way in which the land was broken up into these squares. And I know this is just kind of a mundane thing, right? But this is ethnographic in the sense that people on on this mountain in particular are talking about the fact that all of our land is broken up into these squares. And now that we're going legal, we have to regulate our square in a certain way. And in thinking about our square, we're limited in actually thinking in these collaborative ways, or imagining the landscape in sort of a more robust, holistic sense as being interconnected and stuff like that. So our regenerative agriculture is sort of limited to our property. And so what the dissertation kind of gets at is how these settler colonial property relationships are kind of pre-configuring how regenerative farmers are able to make change, how they're able to survive or not in the market. Um, and just one final point is like, you know, I wanted to think about like, is it better if all of these settlers just leave? What would that look like for the land, and just in ecological sense? And what we found, like ethnographically, when I'm there, was for people who did kind of abandon the land, it just it got purchased by logging companies, or the owner would lease it to log for logging. We're seeing right now, the government is opening up all these federal lands for logging. And so I was like, there's got to be something worth saving in these farmers who, for a lot of them that I studied with, were not there because they wanted to get rich or something like that. They had come up kind of as poor, impoverished people who were marginalized from society in some way, who had found a space to kind of live on their own, make some money with people who were like them, and contribute to the betterment of the place in a way that I didn't see as necessarily damaging per se. But now their life way was going away because of all these other issues of legalization that I think most people know about, right? The price that they're getting is dropping. They're not able to sell as much. They can't get into dispensaries. Actually, policing and surveillance is intensifying in the region in sort of different ways than it was before. Um, and this policing is of course tied to settler colonialism as well, and how sort of the land is managed by the state. And so I saw that these like marginalized settler farmers were also themselves becoming the subject of the same kinds of dispossessive forces, not the same and the same kinds of violence, of course, but the same kind of general logics in a sense of clearing people off this land of the state. Um, and so yeah, I'm excited to see Caitlin next week, and to hear more about what she's thinking about now. But so her work and her book was a really important starting place for thinking about, well, what was my ethnography about who are ostensibly settlers? What are they thinking about, and what kind of changes do they want to make? And I did find that people were open to some kinds of ideas. Like I know some farmers were making deals with certain reservations to sort of give the land to a reservation, but still have permission to grow on it and steward it. And it would have, once they eventually retire, pass away, it would go back to the reservation or something like that. I know a couple of profit sharing relationships where some farms were providing produce and profit when they were able to get profit to the reservation nearby. So I was just trying to think about, what do we realistically, pragmatically do with all these folks who live there now, who are technically settlers on native land, and what are some emancipatory practices that we can promote? And of course, I'm an outsider. I'm from Toronto. I'm a settler myself. These, Canada-U.S. borders are settler constructions, and so uh, I was both an outsider, right? I'm there kind of. I'm not American. I'm not really a cannabis farmer at all. but I am a white person who speaks English and was relatively able to kind of enmesh within the community in a way as not being so much of an outsider. And so that gave me kind of an in to study people who are landowners, who do have employees, and to think about really practically what are all their ongoing issues, what are they thinking about, these sorts of things. So what are the practicalities of settler colonialism? Like, how is it actually working? How is it actually affecting people negatively, even though they are settlers? Which I think was a kind of an interesting point. I use the notion of settler environmentality, which is like we're all sort of enrolled into thinking about land and ecologies in these kind of modernist state focused ways, uh, even though we might not want to be. Um, and what does that sort of mean, right? We're both complicit but want to be critical at the same time. And so that's sort of what the dissertation looks at in terms of settler colonialism in Northern California.
Yeah, great. I think that's where I wanted to go next was about this, whether it's about settler environmentality or probably just much more in a much more practical, straightforward sense, just this whole project of environmental regulation. And I'm struck, by, from the way that land is parsed up into these like funny little squares that cover weird configurations of territory. Um, to also like how it is that land is configured in a regulatory view, right? Regulatory perspectives. I know some of this has to do with kind of settler colonial constructions of nature that I'd love for you to talk about. Because it not only yeah, it sets the landscape in terms of what is possible and what's not possible, what kinds of forces people have to deal with, and what they're compelled to deal with in order to come into the licensed market, and on what terms. And I think you do a lot of good excavation of what the parameters are of that. So I'd love for you to give us just some tastes of what you witnessed in the regulatory and compliance. I think you call it the hellhole, as a direct quote from one of your participants, and what it says about the possibilities as well as obviously the limits of environmental regulation. One thing we've been thinking about a lot at the Cannabis Research Center is both the potential to bring environmental regulation to cannabis, but also as a model for what agriculture could be regulated toward more generally, right? I mean, good luck. But I mean, I don't think industrial agriculture is too interested in environmental outcomes being heavily regulated, certainly as cannabis has to be or is currently in California in any case. But there's both a beneficial element of kind of protecting against the types of land grabs and utter destruction that is left on the Humboldt landscape, left throughout the Northern California landscape through these iterative kind of boom and bust processes. Um, but it also sometimes smacks of a bit of a rear guard and sometimes bit reactive or reactionary kind of form of regulation that actually just drives people into penury, bankruptcy, and losing their licenses or never being able to enter the regulated system at all. So you want to make it accessible. You also have to think about, yeah, how do we regulate for environmental outcomes at all? But if you could just address kind of like some of what you saw in terms of environmental regulation and what contradictions you were grappling with.
Yeah. Wow. So I guess one thing is, yeah, it's kind of a weird time to talk about regulation, right? Because, you know, you poor Americans are really worried about all of your regulatory institutions kind of being dismantled right now. And so it's interesting in the dissertation, kind of looking back, literally just like, how many changes have happened in the last 2 months or last month. It's making this critique of regulation. But it's sort of like now we're like, okay, wait, we're going too far. We want smart regulation. And so what I noticed was that these farmers, of course, they want to be regulated. They want to have these systems of certification, of auditing, and that actually brings value to their product too, right? But what they found was that what I found at least was for a lot of people, they found the regulatory process to be punitive, rather than supportive, or, going through the legalization process meant, of course, having to spend way more money than you did before, and potentially still being denied your license or whatever. But they weren't being supported in actually getting their farm into compliance in ways that they wanted to. And so, they were kind of arguing, well, how do we create a system that's actually making compliant and regenerative farms, as opposed to sort of placing the onus on individual farmers to do that for themselves without any financial support. And so your broader point that you said is like, what's interesting about cannabis, and it's this moment of kind of drawing up regulations from scratch, is like we can imagine different ways to regulate farms and to provide them with the resources they need to get that way, as opposed to sort of something based on fines and surveillance, and a punitive approach. And regulators themselves say that, right? I mean, that's what's interesting about the ethnographic aspect, is like I'm literally talking to somebody who's giving an inspection of a farm, and like this regulator is telling me how silly the regulations are as they're filling out the form.
Right.
Through their checklist. So yeah, that's the ethnographic component, is sort of seeing how everybody feels the confusions and the contradictions and so forth. Some more than others. There were stories of regulators quitting because they felt that it wasn't fair, or that it was actually harming more than it was helping, and so forth. And so the problem with regulation, yeah, was that it made it impossible to farm, essentially, because on the one hand, for a lot of people, uh, they don't have a lot of labor, but they don't also have the time now to be in the gardens because they're having to deal with all this regulatory stuff. And often a lot of it was just literally reading through emails, trying to contact different consultants, trying to figure out if they had their wording right in the email to the appropriate policymaker that they were trying to get to change their mind, and all this stuff. And for a lot of people too, they don't know how to use they don't use the internet. They don't know how to like properly send emails that look nice. It's just not part of what their life was like. And now it sort of had to be in a new way. Um, the one story that I told was sort of just kind of the subjective nature of actually how did the state and the farmers come to understand what stuff was in their 40-acre box in their square. How do we actually know, is this a stream? What class of stream is it? What is the difference between an artificial pond and a natural pond? How do we understand if that is a habitat or not? And so the ethnographic component was like I was actually witnessing how different kinds of environmental scientists, biologists, engineers who had to be hired to sort of write these regulatory reports kind of even didn't agree amongst one another about whether a stream was this class or that class, whether this endangered species was going to be affected by this regenerative organic greenhouse or not. Um, and it was sort of this big social drama, that ultimately everybody there kind of felt was a little bit arbitrary or wasn't necessarily helping anybody. And sort of the one example there is, the farmer is saying, well, I maintain this pond really well, and I care a lot about it, and I've done all this erosion control on it, and I pump oxygen through it to make sure it doesn't get harmful bacteria and algae. But then they're getting denied a license because, well, there might be an endangered species near that pond. But the farmer is saying, well, I've made the habitat for them. And so there's this kind of purposeful separation of humans and animals and nature, in a way that regenerative farming doesn't actually want to support. It wants to actually think about people in this, collaborative environment where humans and nature are working together. But the regulatory apparatus didn't really allow that in some cases. Um, and so the dissertation is like kind of just a close, and again, this is just one farm, and it's very specific kind of encounter with regulation. And it's going to look really different in a lot of different places. But also, yeah, just how regulation is social. It was about relationships between farmers and inspectors and policymakers. And it wasn't so simple as just you read the policy document and you orient your farm around it. There was a lot more sort of going on the ground on what it actually looked like, which ultimately made it impossible for the farm to survive because it was so expensive and time consuming. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you wouldn't be, but you'd be surprised at maybe how common those stories really can be across farms. I think in telling that one story, you're able to reflect, I think, what I heard just countless times on different farms, in across the state, really. Um, and yeah, I mean, this division between humans and nature that specifically applies to cannabis farmers because of the ways that the environment is being regulated and the ways that cannabis is regarded in regulatory circles, particularly at the beginning of regulation, where it really kind of, I think there was different threads of this, but a lot of it was couched in kind of, especially in environmental regulations, in a punitive approach. And these are untrustworthy people that need to be disciplined into forms of regulation, even if they voluntarily kind of come forward. So there was this antagonism from the beginning that I think only in the last year or so have I seen signs of abatement, particularly in Humboldt, kind of through the defeat of Measure A, which was trying to, roll back a lot, even make these environmental restrictions much more intensive, and to kind of shut down essentially even the little modicum of like the flexibility that was built into the laws already, which would have really been the death knell, I think, for most small farmers in Humboldt, such as they are at this point. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
so I really appreciate all that. Um, and it also makes me think through too of like, the questions of alternative agriculture. And I think one thing, there's the form of regulation often is like state to individual, right? Um, where it's a state then giving a list of demands that the individual then needs to meet and comply with, versus other forms of kind of like cooperative regulation or even peer-to-peer regulation, horizontal forms of compliance, community-based kind of stakeholder-driven forms that can't have been common in other kinds of agricultural systems. Even, especially with like tribal fisheries. I mean, there's been a number of different examples from across the world. I've gone kind of in depth about like the allotment program for tobacco. But there are different models, about how farmers can actually be part of regulation rather than being subject to it. And I think you really draw it really nicely, I think, the what it means to be subjected and objected in some ways. So a lot of this then gets us, I mean, I think we've been circling around it, is this idea of land, of terroir. And for folks, yeah, I'll stop and I'll just shut up soon. But if you do have questions, you can always just raise your hand and I'll just make sure the participant list is on my view. Or you can feel free to throw in questions to the chat. If you want to ask it in audio, feel free to raise your hand. Um, but uh, but yeah, about this concept of terroir, which, as you know, is like very important right now in California, and I mean, it has been for some time around the different industries, but in cannabis, as this appellation system hopefully and finally comes together. A lot of my colleagues are doing some really good work in pulling that together. Um, but uh, but yeah, I guess what is your study? I know it was always kind of perpetually under discussion, the formation of appellation. And so you were in a bit kind of prefiguring some ideas of terroir, or how people were thinking about it in advance of an actual appellation system. But I'm curious, like what your study, what you see it as adding to the debates over how to identify the unique qualities of land, to connect those to the plant, anything you want to say about terroir and its formation. And I think one thing you mentioned a little earlier that I want to just like raise, and maybe you can talk about it, is about the kind of leftovers of what I think you refer to roughly as like infrastructures of war, whether it's kind of settler colonial and kind of the, violent, also capitalist histories in the area and how they bear upon the land and still kind of live in it, and what those remnants are and how people kind of build new meanings out of this land. Yeah, anywhere you want to go with that.
Yeah, wow, thank you. Yeah, terroir was something that this farm in particular was at the time really excited about because, as you mentioned in the beginning, in order to survive, they're going the route of being artisanal, of kind of trying to get more of a premium for for their product. And terroir was a way of speaking to certain audiences that they thought might appreciate that because, of course, it comes from other specialty foods and things like that. Um, but what I found, like, sort of in particular about these Humboldt folks, right? Not all Humboldt, but who I was with, was that what was important about terroir is not necessarily the plant or the soil, but the way it reflects a community or a group of people. And so terroir is not just about the land and the practices that go into growing the plant, but that it represents this group of sort of resistive innovators that sort of live off the land in ways that they want to see celebrated, that comes from that countercultural history in some ways, and they don't want it to be forgotten. And so a terroir is a way of both highlighting, of course, the quality of the plants in the soil, but a sense of cultural togetherness and an image of a culture that they don't want to see fade away.
Mm.
Um, and uh, on your point about, like, sort of regulation being collaborative or something like that, as
Mhm.
opposed to sort of a top-down, the terroir story was kind of interesting in that way because a lot of farmers were actually collaborating on scientific projects together that I sort of saw as like a citizen science in a way. They were growing each other's genetics in different ways, trying indoors, outdoors. They were actually measuring things like keeping track of the temperature each day, trying different gardens at different elevations, trying really hard. They were inviting like scientists and botanists and chemists from the East Coast to come over and measure sort of the chemical molecular qualities of their plants to actually try and produce like a scientific data-driven story about how their practices and what their regenerative soils and such were providing for the plant. What I really liked about terroir too, though, was that for some people, it was getting away from the dichotomy of indoor versus outdoor for some people, because they could see that, it was actually possible to have an indoor terroir. You could have like a really cool hydroponic terroir.
Mhm.
And you could also have a cool outdoor sun-grown terroir, and that this actually added value that was not competitive, but provided like different experiences as opposed to something more opposing, which was more common, right? They didn't want all the growing to go to the cities. What was really important was that it was grown under the sun and that this is environmentally friendly, as opposed to the methods that are actually born from prohibition by having to hide underground.
Mhm.
So yeah, so there was actually some interesting ideas about how they can make sort of indoor and outdoor coexist together without being sort of confrontational through terroir. They're offering different kinds of terroir. Um, but for the most part, though, I found that people were a little bit cynical about it because it was really hard to get people to care on the consumer end, right? So a lot of what went into terroir was educating, was trying to think about how do we actually get people in the dispensary to care about what these qualities are that are driven by the specific practices and the specific ecological conditions that it's grown in the way that they might care about a wine or organic food in the grocery store or something like that. So there was a lot of sort of consumer education, anxiety, and also practice trying to get people to think about terroir. And I do think that having sort of a more forward state program would do a lot of that work for people, so it's not left to the farmers. um, but yeah. But it also really did sort of reflect a sincere care about the landscape. Like, it really mattered that the soil was really robust and rich, and that the sunlight was hitting the plants at a certain way over a certain number of months, and that this genuinely affected its molecular composition, and that this mattered a lot. And so it wasn't just kind of a cynical marketing thing, but people were really actually trying to make terroir a real thing, not just sort of ideologically, but in their practices. Um, yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. It's interesting, I mean, just going back to like your earlier note on property and how it's um, parsed up into these little blocks. And also, you know, there's, but that also becomes the conditions of possibility for these heterotopic kind of unique environments. that people are allowed to kind of experiment, to do things differently, to try to enact their own vision of the world, that is
Mm,
both a blessing and a curse, right?
mm,
Because you're encumbered by the property system, and yet it allows you a certain kind of freedom, which I think is actually analogous in a lot of ways to the ways that I've thought of kind of illegality. That
mm,
it's this kind of it's a blessing and a curse because it allows you a certain form of freedom to be free from kind of liberal rule of law, to be outside of its strictures, to be able to create your own markets, to create meaning and community and codes of secrecy and market networks and whatever the case might be. But yet, obviously, it's that freedom only comes at the cost of being criminalized, right? And so I think both of those things almost kind of provide mirror images of what legalization and prohibition do. It's like the blessing and curse of it both, because they're both still structured by liberal rule of law in a capitalist system, right? Anyway, um, which I think kind of, I mean, I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on that, um, but I do have one last question, but I also just want to leave it open in case, and does anyone else want to jump in before, I know I've just been talking, I've been waiting for a um, question to hop in, but if anyone has any questions, I'll just give it like 15 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to add on the terroir point, I mean, in the broader discussion of terroir as it exists, from its French origins and whatnot, from what I can tell, is that the cannabis terroir is pretty unique in that it's suggesting that the way something is grown changes the high that one gets, and so it actually affects consciousness. And this is different than like a cheese or a wine or something, which is often just sort of more about how it tastes in your mouth, or sort of its experiential qualities in the consumption. But there's something about the cannabis terroir which is pretty cool in that it's actually proposing that it's affecting sort of its medicinal qualities, which is sort of above and beyond, I think, the terroir that's often explained in food and stuff. So I think if cannabis can emphasize how important terroir is, for that reason, I think it's really useful.
Had some interesting conversations with the California Department of Food and Agriculture that is partially tasked with understanding the relationship of agriculture to what kind of high and experience that the cannabis actually gives. So it's like, I mean, maybe looping back to your environmental regulation question and the hellhole that is. I mean, trying to quantify and to really pinpoint and maybe have like some survey about like whether or not it meets a certain criteria, right? That's going to
Mm.
be a real challenge, I think, for the Appalachians. But one I'm really curious and only know a rudimentary amount about, but I would love to see it occur if it can. And
Yeah.
yeah, I do have one last question, and seeing as no one's interrupted me yet, which people should feel free. Um, and this is a geeky question, so apologies. But it's in the title, so I figure it's a good one to grapple with, is you crafting cannabinated capitalism. And
Mm,
I loved this term cannabinated capitalism. It's something that I think really brings in a lot of some of the historical anthropology around commodities, and things like work on sugar and tea and coffee and other such other kind of like uh products that are both exciting to the human body, like they have effects, but also are incredibly important to the caloric reproduction of
mm.
kind of working populations. And I'm really interested in yeah, how you maybe I've already said it, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about like what cannabination does. And then the other piece, and I know we have just a few minutes, but if you want to touch on it at all, is this kind of horizon that you set up theoretically about what I think theorists generally call like capitalist realism. Um, and I think this is something I've grappled with a lot in my own work too, where ultimately you're studying forms of different kinds of capitalism and how to engage with this kind of horizon where capitalism seems to be the horizon, right? Where there seems to be no possibilities almost beyond, where then what the work of the academic becomes is one of kind of reform, harm reduction, kind of eking out, making meaning in the interstices, in the gaps, you know. Uh, so anyway, I thought anyway, those are two kind of big.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you. Yeah, the cannabinated capitalism one, is something I'm still trying to think about. And yeah, the basic point is sort of modernity, post-colonial kind of context, is something that was really driven by what Alex Moulton calls endorphinated capitalism. So sugar, coffee, tobacco to some extent are about sort of getting you going, getting you up, keeping working, keeping speeding. The pharmaceutical sort of industry is like a kind of an extension of that, and sort of the contemporary era where we can be using amphetamines and all these things to sort of get through our intensive neoliberal work days. But so the cannabis is like an interesting like curveball to that story, in that the high kind of works a little differently. It's about not to risk at universalizing the experience, right? It's a little bit more about creativity, about relaxation, about slowing down, about changing perspective, in the way that it affects consciousness and so on. And also just about like laughing and having a good time with one another and that sort of thing. And so I was curious why, or what it means that legalization is sort of mainstreaming this kind of experience, or this relationship to a substance that sort of colonialism and so forth had done to other substances. And because we've sort of exhausted the planet in a way as species, of things that will sort of travel around the world in the way that sugar did, that coffee did. We may have sort of niche examples like quinoa or acai berry or something like that. But cannabis is kind of this, maybe the last big one or something that's going to kind of go in this big way. And
Mm.
it is happening, Southeast Asia, sort of Thailand's picking up, all these places.
Yeah.
Um, and I just sort of wondered, how does that interact with capitalism, which is sort of a global project right now. Um, so why does capitalism like it or not? What does it do for it? To some extent, it's a palliative for what are sort of the struggles of the times, right? I mean, we have growing inequality, less access to medicine. Opioids are currently kind of demonized a little bit. And so cannabis is kind of has a role in filling a lot of these voids in some way. And people who never used it in their life are now sort of taking their 10 milligram gummies every day. And so I have sort of just seen it like ethnographically become sort of more prominent in the way sugar or coffee is. And I wondered just sort of what does that mean for capitalism? And but it's changed literally in the last month. Like, the Trump administration, and sort of their approach to things. I don't know if that's going to continue with the cannabinated capitalism, right? I think it's going back to sort of a carceral, intensifying a carceral kind of vision of drugs. I think in a lot of ways that's less sort of liberatory, even if it was a capitalist realist liberation. I think there was just an announcement they want to execute drug dealers or something like that. So I've almost like 180'd on the cannabinated capitalism, because it's almost like maybe it's not going to happen anymore or something like that.
Well, in the US in any case. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, these are big questions. One that I'm really happy you're thinking about and on the scene. It's been really fun talking with you. And I wish you luck post PhD. I'm looking forward to where you head and what comes next.
Thank you all. Thanks for being
Definitely keep
here.
in touch, and yeah, thank you so much. Just a reminder that yeah, next time we'll be talking. It's actually a month from now, April 4th. We'll be talking with Dr. Caitlin Reed of Cal Poly Humboldt, with Seth LaRosa here at UC Berkeley, a grad student, and after that we'll be talking with Dr. Robert Eiler from Sonoma State on the economic impacts of cannabis on North Coast County economies. And the facilitator of that will be Janine Coleman from the Origins Council. And just to note that we're actually adding a third event in early May, I believe May 2nd at the same time. And that's actually going to be with the Nevada County Cannabis Alliance, the California Resource Conservation Districts, as well as the Rural County Organization, RCRC. And all three of us, along with a researcher, Margiana Peterson-Rockney, who I've worked with on issues of local bans, cultivation bans, we'll all be discussing a video that the Nevada County Cannabis Alliance and the Resource Conservation Districts drew up to put local regulation, whether they're permits or bans, into a new perspective, 6 or 7 years into legalization. So we're gonna have a panel discussion about that video, and I think it'll be a good event. I'm also have an event in the works. I just sent out invitations. We'll be talking with different scholars from Jamaica, from Brazil, from Colombia, and from Paraguay about cannabis cultivation in the Americas. And this is part of a broader uh, tent we're trying to build to engage more people around the world. I was just in touch with researchers from Africa today, and this really is a budding research field, and I hope that you all continue to be a part of it. Thanks so much for attending today. On the left-hand side of your screen, there's, if you want to sign up for the monthly newsletter, please do that. And then on the right-hand side is a link tree for all of our upcoming events, our website, social media accounts, and all that kind of thing. So we'll leave this slide up for a few minutes until people filter out. And thanks to the Resources Legacy Fund that gives the Cannabis Research Center our lifeblood, the funds to be able to do fun things like this, and also to Peng Lor, who is our communications and administrative specialist, who makes all this happen. So thanks, Peng, and thanks everyone for coming.